The fault that could level the Pacific Northwest just moved. Yesterday, a magnitude 5.5 earthquake struck 218 kilometers off the southern Oregon coast, at the doorstep of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. This is the fault that last ruptured in the year 1700, in a magnitude 9 that sent a tsunami all the way to Japan, and it has been loading in silence ever since. Stay with me, and I will explain what actually broke, what the big one would do to 3 states, and why scientists are watching the silence even more than the shaking. Yesterday morning, at 35 minutes past 11 Universal Time, a magnitude 5.5 earthquake struck the Pacific Ocean about 218 kilometers, roughly 135 miles west of Bandon on the southern Oregon coast. It happened in the dark, in the early hours of the morning for the west coast, far out under deep water. The United States Geological Survey put the epicenter near 43.38 degrees north, 127.08 degrees west, at a shallow depth of about 10 kilometers. There was no damage. There were no injuries. The alert level was green. By every conventional measure, this was a non-event, and yet people up and down the coast, from Northern California to British Columbia, felt something more than the ground. The shaking itself reached as far north as Victoria, more than 600 kilometers away, which tells you the energy traveled cleanly through the crust. But the reaction that mattered was not physical. It was the cold recognition of where this quake happened. Because that patch of ocean floor, 200 miles off the coast of Oregon, is the single most watched, most feared stretch of fault in North America. And for a few minutes yesterday, it moved. A magnitude 5.5 on its own is nothing. The planet produces well over 1,000 earthquakes that size every single year. In the 7 days around this one, the global catalog logged more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater. If this quake had happened almost anywhere else, no one outside a seismology lab would have noticed. What changes everything is the address. This earthquake landed at the southern doorstep of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the fault that scientists believe will one day produce the largest natural disaster in the recorded history of the United States. You have to understand what Cascadia is to understand why a modest offshore jolt made millions of people look up. Cascadia is a megathrust fault, roughly 1,100 kilometers, about 700 miles long. It runs offshore from Cape Mendocino in Northern California all the way north to Vancouver Island in Canada. Along that entire length, the Juan de Fuca plate is being shoved underneath the North American plate, slowly, relentlessly, a few centimeters a year. That is the engine. And that engine has not released a great earthquake in 326 years. When a fault like this is quiet, that quiet is not peace. It is pressure. The 2 plates are locked together near the surface, stuck, while the deeper machinery keeps grinding forward. Strain accumulates in the rock the way tension builds in a bent steel bar. Eventually, the lock breaks all at once, and 3 centuries of stored motion is released in a few minutes of catastrophic shaking. The expected result is a magnitude 9, not a magnitude 7. A magnitude 9, an earthquake thousands of times more powerful than the one that struck off Oregon yesterday, followed by a tsunami that would reach the coast in as little as 15 to 20 minutes. So when a quake, any quake, happens right there, at the place everyone is waiting for, the human response is immediate and understandable. People do not think, that was a small oceanic earthquake unrelated to the main fault. They think, is this it? Is this the beginning? And the honest answer is the reason we are spending the next 20 minutes on this. Because the answer is more interesting, and in some ways more unsettling, than a simple yes or no. Let me be precise about the mechanics, because the precision is the story, not a footnote to it. Yesterday's earthquake was almost certainly not a slip on the Cascadia megathrust itself. At 218 kilometers offshore and 10 kilometers deep, this event most likely happened inside the oceanic crust seaward of the subduction zone, out in the broad region of the Blanco Transform and the Gorda and Juan de Fuca plates, where the young ocean floor is cut by transform faults and is constantly deforming under stress. Earthquakes out there are common. They are not the megathrust breaking. That distinction matters enormously, and a lot of coverage gets it wrong. There is a world of difference between saying the big one just started and saying the plate that will eventually cause the big one just twitched. Yesterday was the second thing, not the first. The locked interface, the part of the fault that actually fails in a great earthquake, did not rupture. What we saw was activity on and around the very plate system that feeds that locked fault. But here is why this is not reassuring. In the way it sounds, the thing that broke yesterday is part of the same machine. The Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates are the slabs being driven under North America. They are the input to Cascadia. So while this specific earthquake was not the megathrust, it was a reminder written in seismograph traces, that the whole system is alive and under load. The fear people felt was not foolish. It was just pointed at the wrong specific event, while being entirely correct about the larger danger sitting offshore. To grasp how overdue Cascadia is, you have to go back to the night of January 26th in the year 1700. That is the date of the last full rupture of this fault, a magnitude 9 class megathrust earthquake. And the remarkable thing is how we know the date so precisely, given that no European was there to record it and no instrument existed to measure it. We know it from 3 independent lines of evidence that all point to the same night. The first is what scientists call the orphan tsunami. On that night, a tsunami struck the coast of Japan, with no local earthquake to explain it, and Japanese records documented the flooding in careful detail. Working backward across the Pacific, researchers matched that wave to a source off the Pacific Northwest. The second line of evidence is the ghost forests, stands of dead western red cedar along the Oregon and Washington coast, trees that were killed when the land suddenly dropped during the quake and salt water rushed into their roots. Tree ring dating placed their death in the winter of 1699 to 1700. The third is the oral history of indigenous peoples along the coast, stories of a night the ground shook and the ocean came in, passed down for generations. 3 separate records, from rock, from trees, and from human memory, converge on the same event. That is how we know Cascadia produces magnitude 9 earthquakes, because it has, and we can date the last one to a single winter night, 326 years ago. And that interval, 326 years, is the number that should make you pay attention because it is long. It is longer, in fact, than this fault's shorter recurrence cycles suggest it should stay quiet. The full picture of Cascadia's history comes from the seafloor itself. When a great earthquake strikes offshore, it shakes loose underwater landslides, sending sediment cascading down the continental slope. Those deposits, called turbidits, settle in layers, and each layer is essentially a fingerprint of a past earthquake, stacked in order through time like pages in a book. By drilling cores and dating those layers, scientists have reconstructed roughly 10,000 years of Cascadia's earthquake history. What that record shows is sobering. Over the last 10,000 years, Cascadia has produced something on the order of 40 major earthquakes. Roughly 10 of those reached the full margin, the entire fault rupturing at once, in the magnitude 8.5 and above range. The average spacing between great earthquakes runs to a few hundred years. And critically, the southern third of the fault, the stretch right off Oregon and Northern California where yesterday's quake happened, appears to rupture more often than the fault as a whole. That is why the formal hazard estimates land where they do. The probability of a major Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years is put at roughly 15% for a full margin rupture, and meaningfully higher, commonly cited at around 1 in 3 for the southern segment alone. 1 in 3 in the next 50 years for the exact region that just produced a quake. These are not fringe numbers. They are the consensus, baked into building codes and emergency planning across 3 states. The fault is not a hypothetical. It is a clock, and we are deep into the part of the cycle where it has gone off before. And it is worth being concrete about what destroy actually means here, because the title is not an exaggeration. A full Cascadia rupture would shake coastal cities for 4 to 6 minutes, not the 10 or 20 seconds people picture when they think of an earthquake. The ground motion alone would damage or collapse older buildings, bridges, and overpasses from Northern California to British Columbia. Then the tsunami would follow, reaching the nearest beaches in as little as 15 to 20 minutes, leaving coastal towns almost no time to climb to high ground. Roads would buckle, the coastal highway would fracture in hundreds of places, and entire stretches of the Pacific Northwest could be cut off from outside help for weeks. Emergency planners do not talk about this in terms of a bad day. They talk about it in terms of the largest natural disaster the modern United States has ever faced. That is the event the 1700 earthquake was, and that is the event this fault is built to produce again. Now, I want to tell you about the second thing that happened this week, because on its own it would be a story. And combined with the earthquake, it is the reason this video exists. In the days surrounding yesterday's quake, the instruments watching Cascadia recorded an unusually high level of something called tectonic tremor. Over a single 7-day window, monitoring picked up on the order of 3,000 to 3,100 individual tremor epicenters along the subduction zone, with one evening tally near 535 discrete slow-slip events. This is not the shaking you feel. You cannot feel it at all. It is a phenomenon called episodic tremor and slip, and it happens deep, on the down-dip part of the plate interface, well below the locked zone that produces great earthquakes. Down there, where the rock is hotter and behaves differently, the 2 plates do not stick and snap. They slide slowly, over days and weeks, releasing energy not as a sudden jolt, but as a faint, continuous structural hum that only sensitive seismometers can detect. Under Cascadia, these episodes come on a fairly regular rhythm, roughly every 14 months in the north, somewhat more often in the south. And most of this week's tremor was concentrated under exactly the southern end of the margin in Northern California, with a smaller cluster up under the Puget Sound region near Seattle. So in the same week, in the same stretch of fault, you had elevated deep tremor below and a moderate earthquake in the oceanic plate offshore. Are the two directly connected? Probably not in any simple mechanical sense, because they happen at different depths, through different processes. But they are both signs of a fault system that is very much awake, clustered in the one place the public has been told for decades to fear. Here's the idea that flips your intuition, and it is the heart of why scientists watch Cascadia so closely. We tend to think that a quiet fault is a safe fault. No earthquakes, no problem. With a locked megathrust, the opposite is true. The silence is the danger. The silence is the sound of strain being stored instead of released. Think of it this way. Every year, the deep part of the fault keeps slipping, keeps driving the plates forward. But the shallow, locked part does not move. So the mismatch between the deep motion and the stuck surface has to go somewhere, and it goes into the rock as elastic strain, bending it, loading it, year after year, century after century. Each one of those slow slip episodes I just described transfers a little more stress from the deep, sliding portion up onto the locked, brittle portion above it, the part that will eventually fail. The fault gets a little more loaded every time the deep section hums. So a quiet, earthquake-free Cascadia is not a reassuring Cascadia. It is a fault holding its breath. The honest scientific position, and I want to be very clear here, is that these tremor episodes happen routinely, and they are not reliable short-term predictors. No one can look at this week's data and forecast the big one. Nobody can tell you it will happen this year, or this decade, or this century. But it is equally honest to say that every one of these events occurs against the backdrop of a fault that is overdue against its shorter cycles, and that is currently storing the energy for magnitude 9. Yesterday did not change those odds. It just reminded everyone that the quietest fault in America is not asleep. It is loading. I want to widen the lens now because the Oregon quake did not happen in isolation. In the same 24 to 48 hour window, the entire ring of fire seemed to come alive at once. Off Cordova, Alaska, a magnitude 5.3 struck in the same Gulf of Alaska margin that produced the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake. A magnitude 9.2, the second largest quake ever recorded by instruments. Across the Pacific, an earthquake swarm fired off the coast of western Luzon in the northern Philippines on the Manila Trench. There were continuing aftershocks near Mindanao, where a magnitude 7.8 had struck weeks before. There was a magnitude 5.2 in eastern Sichuan, China, a cluster of events across Indonesia, a deep quake near Japan's volcano islands, a magnitude 4.9 in the Kermadec Islands, and lingering aftershocks in Venezuela. Over the prior 7 days, the worldwide count of magnitude 4.5 and above came to 108 earthquakes. When you see all of that listed at once, it feels like the planet is doing something coordinated, something building toward a climax. And this is exactly where I have to slow you down. Because the feeling is powerful, and the reality is more mundane. The ring of fire is always active. In any random 48-hour window, simple statistics guarantee that several moderate to large earthquakes will be scattered around the Pacific. There is no evidence that an offshore Oregon quake and a Philippine trench swarm are causing one another. The genuine physical connections between distant earthquakes are limited and short range, mostly aftershocks, and occasionally what is called dynamic triggering, where the seismic waves of a truly enormous quake nudge another fault that was already right at its breaking point. None of that is happening here. The honest framing, and I think the more compelling one, is not that the planet is coordinating. It is that we are watching a single, restless, interconnected plate system express itself in many places at once. The Pacific's entire rim is under continuous, accumulating strain along its whole length. Cascadia is not a lone bomb. It is one chamber in a loaded global machine. And this week we got to see several chambers rattle at the same time. If there is one place in that global picture that deserves more of your attention than the Oregon quake, it is the Manila Trench. And I say that carefully because it is easy to fixate on the story closest to home and miss the one with the higher stakes. The Manila Trench runs offshore of western Luzon in the northern Philippines, and what happened there this week was a swarm, a cluster of earthquakes, including a magnitude 5.0 and several magnitude 4 and above events, with no single main shock to explain them as ordinary aftershocks. That detail, a swarm without a main shock, is what makes seismologists lean in. Statistically, a swarm with no clear main event is the configuration most often, though still rarely, associated with a possible foreshock sequence, the kind of restlessness that sometimes precedes something larger. And the Manila Trench is not a fault you want restless. Its plates are converging at an exceptionally fast rate, sited at roughly 100 millimeters a year, and it has gone a long time without a great strain-relieving earthquake. That combination means it is loading quickly. Modeling studies estimate its maximum credible earthquake at around magnitude 9.2, with tsunami run-ups that could reach nearly 15 meters on the northern Philippine coast, and arrival times as short as 2 minutes for the dense coastlines around Manila Bay. 2 minutes. There's no meaningful warning in 2 minutes. Now, the honest caveat applies here just as it does for Cascadia. The base rate for a swarm escalating into a great earthquake is low. Most swarms fade and nothing happens. This is a watch closely situation, not a prediction. But when you stack the fast convergence, the long quiet interval, the swarm pattern, the magnitude 9.2 ceiling, and a 2-minute tsunami over millions of people, the Manila Trench is arguably the most dangerous node that lit up this week, more so than the quake that grabbed the headlines off Oregon. So where does this leave us? Yesterday's earthquake off Oregon was, in isolation, a minor offshore event that did no damage and posed no threat. But it served as a legitimate prompt to look hard at the single most consequential geologic hazard facing the United States. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is locked, it is overdue against its shorter cycles, it is producing elevated deep tremor right now, and it sits next to the very plate system that just moved. None of that predicts a rupture tomorrow. All of it explains why a quake that would be ignored anywhere else made people in Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver stop and stare at the floor. What should you actually watch for in the days ahead? Honestly, not the things that go viral. Not sunspots, not solar flares, not the idea that the sun or some secret installation is triggering all this. The energy involved in those claims is orders of magnitude too small to move a fault. The geomagnetic field was quiet this week, even as the sun looked busy, and the earthquakes happened anyway, which is the opposite of what those theories predict. The seismic networks are open and cross-checked across many countries, so the data is not being hidden from you. The thing actually worth your attention is far less dramatic and far more useful, which is whether your own household is ready for the day this fault does let go, because the one certainty in all of this is that it eventually will. The deepest discomfort in the Cascadia story is not that the warning is loud. It is that the warning is so quiet. A moderate jolt 200 miles offshore, a faint tremor no one can feel, a swarm on the far side of the ocean. If that is the level of signal we get, then the hardest question of all is the one that has no answer. How would we ever tell the difference between another ordinary quiet week and the last quiet week before everything changes? We will keep watching this fault, because watching is the only thing we can do. But yesterday, for a few minutes, the quietest fault in America spoke just loudly enough to remind us it is still there, still loading, and still counting down on a clock we cannot read.